I still remember the sound of pounding on my front door before sunrise, sharp and relentless, like it was trying to break more than just wood. When I opened it, a deputy stood there holding papers that said I had only hours to leave the home I had lived in for decades. My name was on them. My address was on them. And the person who had filed them was my own daughter. In that moment, my world collapsed. Everything I believed about love, trust, and family shattered at once, and I had no choice but to fight for my life, my dignity, and my home. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll always be the first to catch our latest stories. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Margaret Wilson, and I am 64 years old. For most of my life, I believed I had done everything right. I worked hard, raised my daughter with care, stood by my husband through sickness and health, and built a quiet, honest life in a small town by the water. After my husband passed away, I told myself that the hardest part was behind me. I truly believe that. I live in a wooden house near Lake Michigan, in Traverse City, Michigan. My husband and I bought this place more than 40 years ago, when we were young and full of plans. Back then, the house was smaller, the paint was peeling, and the roof leaked every spring. We fixed it together, one project at a time, saving money, learning from mistakes, laughing when things went wrong. Over the years, this house became more than shelter. It became proof of everything we had built. Every morning, I sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watch the lake wake up. The water changes color with the sky, shifting from dark blue to silver, then to soft gold. Gulls circle overhead. Sometimes I hear fishing boats in the distance. Those quiet moments remind me that I am still here, still breathing, still part of the world. After my husband died, I struggled at first. There were nights when the house felt too empty, when every sound reminded me that he was gone. But I learned how to live again. I kept my routines. I tended my small garden. I volunteered at the local church. I tutored children whose parents could not afford private lessons. Teaching had always been part of me, even after retirement. People in the neighborhood often stopped by to check on me. They brought casseroles, asked about my roses, and waved when I walked to the mailbox. I was grateful, but I never felt helpless. I had always been independent. I paid my bills on time. I kept my records organized. I trusted myself. My daughter, Rachel, was my greatest pride. I still remembered her as a little girl running barefoot through this yard, laughing as her father chased her with a garden hose. I paid for her college education. I helped with her wedding. When she married Evan, I welcomed him into the family without hesitation. I believed that love and honesty were enough to hold a family together. For years, our relationship seemed stable. We celebrated holidays together. We shared meals. We exchanged birthday cards and polite phone calls. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic conflicts. If there were small tensions, I ignored them. I told myself that every family had them. Looking back, I realized how safe I felt. I thought my life was settled. The mortgage was paid off. My savings were modest but steady. My health was good. My house was mine. My daughter was grown. I believed I had reached a stage where nothing truly bad could happen anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I noticed small changes. Rachel called less often. Her messages became shorter. When she visited, she seemed distracted. Once, she asked me if I ever forgot things. I laughed it off. At my age, I expected a little forgetfulness. It did not worry me. I never imagined that those tiny moments were warnings. I thought I was safe. I thought my home, my memories, and my family were untouchable. I believed that everything I had worked for was secure. I had no idea how wrong I was. If you're still watching and feeling the tension build, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Things are about to get much more complicated, and what happens next will change everything. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. After years of believing that my life had settled into something solid and dependable, I began to notice small changes that I could not immediately explain. At first, they were easy to ignore. A missed phone call, a delayed reply, a visit that never happened. None of it seemed serious enough to question. I told myself that Rachel was busy with her own life, her job, her marriage, her responsibilities. That was normal. That was adulthood. But over time, the distance grew. Her messages became shorter. Where she once asked about my garden or my church friends, she now replied with brief phrases and polite emojis. Our phone conversations felt rushed, as if she were constantly watching the clock. When I asked how she was doing, she answered vaguely. When I shared something about my day, she listened without real interest. Then the questions about money began. One afternoon, during a rare visit, Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone while I poured tea. She casually asked about my retirement income. A few minutes later, she wondered how much I kept in savings. Not long after that, Evan joined in, talking about long-term planning and smart financial moves. They spoke in careful, rehearsed tones, as if they had practiced the conversation beforehand. I felt uncomfortable, but I did not show it. I reminded them that my finances were stable and that I had planned carefully for years. I had never needed help managing my money. They nodded, but their expressions told me they were not satisfied. A few weeks later, they suggested that I consider selling the house. We were sitting in the living room, sunlight pouring through the windows, when Rachel mentioned how expensive property had become near the lake. Evan added that investors were paying high prices for waterfront homes. He said it might be a good time to cash out. Rachel suggested that I could move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to maintain. I listened quietly and then told them no. This house was my life. It was my marriage, my memories, my sense of belonging. I was not interested in turning it into a business transaction. When I refused, the mood changed. Their smiles faded. The conversation ended quickly. They left earlier than usual. After that, everything felt different. Rachel visited less often. She canceled plans at the last minute. She stopped calling just to talk. When I reached out, she sounded distracted, distant. Evan rarely spoke to me at all. Then came the question that stayed with me. During one brief phone call, Rachel hesitated before asking if I ever forgot things. She wondered if I sometimes felt confused or lost track of time. Her voice sounded gentle, but there was something underneath it, something calculating. I laughed and brushed it off, saying that everyone forgets small things as now and then. But later that night, I lay awake thinking about it. Why would she ask that? I began paying closer attention to myself. I checked my calendar more often. I reread emails to make sure I had understood them correctly. I reviewed my bills twice before mailing them. I tested my memory with crossword puzzles and number games. Everything seemed normal, yet doubt had already been planted. Slowly, without realizing it, I became more cautious. I organized my documents. I placed important papers in labeled folders. I made copies of my bank statements. I reviewed my will and insurance policies. I told myself I was just being responsible, but deep down, I sensed that something was shifting. The warmth in my family was fading. Conversations felt forced. Silence replaced laughter. I still believed in my daughter's love, but cracks were forming in that belief. At the time, I did not understand what those cracks meant. I only knew that the foundation of my life was beginning to tremble, and I had no idea that a storm was already on its way. If you're still watching and starting to sense something isn't right, please comment number 2 below to show you're paying attention. The next chapter reveals a shocking twist that no one saw coming. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. That morning began like so many others. I woke up before the sun had fully risen, listening to the soft rhythm of waves against the shore. The lake was calm, wrapped in pale gray mist, and the air carried the familiar scent of pine and damp wood. I moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb the silence that had become my companion since my husband passed away. I brewed my coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching light slowly spread across the water. For a few minutes, everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. I had no idea that within moments, that sense of safety would be ripped away. The knock came suddenly. It was loud, sharp, and relentless, not the gentle tap of a neighbor or the casual knock of a delivery driver. This was firm, official, and urgent. It echoed through the hallway and into my chest. My heart began to race before my mind could catch up. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter. No one ever came to my door this early. A quiet fear crept into my stomach as I walked toward the front entrance. When I looked through the small glass window, I saw a man in uniform standing on my porch, holding a clipboard. I opened the door slowly. He introduced himself as a deputy sheriff and explained that he was there to deliver court documents. His voice was polite but distant, as if he were reading from a script he had repeated many times before. He handed me a thick stack of papers and asked me to confirm my name. I took the documents with trembling hands. At first, the words did not make sense. Legal language blurred together. Property order, enforcement deadline, plaintiff, defendant. Then I saw it. Rachel Thompson. My daughter's name was printed clearly near the top of the page. For a moment, I could not breathe. My vision narrowed, and the room seemed to tilt. I read the lines again and again, hoping I had misunderstood. According to these papers, Rachel had filed a legal claim against me. The court had granted her control of my home. I was being ordered to leave. The deadline was 1 o'clock that afternoon. I felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath me. The deputy explained that he was required to return later that day if the order was not contested. He was not unkind, but he was firm. This was procedure. This was the law. His job was not to judge, only to enforce. After he left, I stood frozen in the doorway. Then I noticed them. Across the street, near the edge of my neighbor's driveway, Rachel and Evan were standing together. They were watching my house. They did not wave. They did not approach. They simply observed, as if waiting for something inevitable to happen. Our eyes met. Rachel did not look away. There was no guilt in her expression, no hesitation, only cold distance. Something inside me broke. Shock turned into pain. Pain turned into anger. Anger hardened into clarity. I realized in that moment that this had not been sudden. This had been planned, carefully, quietly, over months. I closed the door and leaned against it, pressing the papers to my chest. My hands were shaking, but my mind was racing. I forced myself to read every page. That was when I noticed the first inconsistency. The address listed for legal service was not mine. It was unfamiliar. It was wrong. Then I saw the signature. It did not look like mine. A small spark of resistance ignited inside me. I looked at the clock. It was just after 7 in the morning. I had less than 6 hours. I was terrified. I was heartbroken, but I was not defeated. I gathered the papers, took a deep breath, and told myself one thing: I would not let them take my home without a fight. If you're still watching and feeling the emotional weight of this story, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here. What happens next will test strength, courage, and truth. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After the door closed behind me, I stood in the hallway for several seconds, holding the stack of papers as if they might dissolve in my hands. My heart was still pounding, my thoughts tangled in fear and disbelief, but I knew I could not afford to freeze. Every minute mattered now. I walked into the kitchen, spread the documents across the table, and forced myself to breathe slowly. In through my nose, out through my mouth. I had taught anxious students this technique for years. Now I was using it on myself. I began reading. Page by page, line by line, I studied every word. The language was dense and confusing, filled with legal terms designed to overwhelm ordinary people. Still, I persisted. I underlined unfamiliar phrases. I circled dates. I compared signatures. The more I read, the more inconsistencies I found. The service address was wrong. The handwriting did not match mine. The timeline made no sense. My shock slowly transformed into focus. I went to my bedroom closet and pulled out the small fireproof safe that sat on the top shelf. It was heavy and cold against my arms. Inside were the records of my life, the deed to my home, decades of tax receipts, insurance policies, old bank statements, and my husband's will. Everything I had carefully stored for years and now became my shield. I laid the documents beside the court papers and began matching dates and names. Each correct record felt like a quiet victory. Each false entry in their file felt like proof of betrayal. Using my phone, I photographed every page. I labeled each image. I placed the originals in a folder and arranged them in order. Then I wrote a simple timeline on a yellow notepad, listing events, signatures, and filing dates. My hands were steady now. Fear had given way to determination. By the time I checked the clock, it was nearly 8:30. I grabbed my purse and the car keys and drove toward the county courthouse. Morning traffic crawled along the narrow streets. Red lights seemed endless. Every delay felt personal. My stomach tightened with every passing minute. The courthouse rose in front of me, like a gray monument to order and judgment. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor cleaner. People moved through the halls, clutching folders like lifelines. I joined them. At the civil clerk's office, I explained that I needed to file an emergency motion. The clerk, a man in his 40s with listened carefully and reviewed my documents. His expression shifted as he scanned the pages. He pointed out the incorrect address. He noted the mismatched signatures. He entered the case number into his computer and frowned. Then he paused. Quietly, he told me that the system showed an earlier filing connected to my name. Months before, Rachel had submitted a petition seeking control over my financial affairs. She had claimed I was no longer capable of managing my own assets. The court had rejected it for lack of evidence. I felt as if I had been struck. This was not a sudden act of desperation. This was a long-term plan. My daughter had been preparing for this long before I ever suspected anything. The clerk helped me complete the emergency forms. I wrote about improper service. I described the forged documents. I attached my proof of ownership. My wrist ached from writing, but I did not slow down. When I finally submitted the paperwork, he stamped it and handed me a receipt. It was almost noon. I sat on a bench in the hallway, clutching my folder, staring at the clock on the wall. My heart was racing again, but this time it was not from fear. It was from resolve. I was no longer running blindly. I was preparing for war. If you're still watching and amazed by how fast things are unfolding, please comment number 4 below to show your support. The next chapter takes us straight into the most intense moment yet. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. I sat on a narrow wooden bench outside the courtroom, holding my folder so tightly that my fingers began to ache. The hallway was quiet except for the low murmur of distant voices and the occasional echo of footsteps. A clock hung above the double doors, its second hand moving with slow cruelty. Each tick reminded me that my future was being decided only a few feet away. I tried to breathe steadily, but my chest felt tight. My thoughts raced in circles. Had I missed something? Was my evidence enough? Had I prepared properly? I reminded myself that I had done everything I could in the time I was given. Still, doubt whispered in the back of my mind. Then I saw them. Rachel and Evan walked down the hallway with their attorney, a tall man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase. They moved with confidence, speaking quietly among themselves. Rachel looked composed, her posture straight, her face carefully controlled. Evan's expression was calm, almost bored. Neither of them acknowledged me at first. For a moment, I barely recognized my own daughter. This was not the girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. This was not the teenager who cried when she left for college. The woman walking past me now felt like a stranger. We entered the courtroom together. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. Wooden panels lined the walls. Fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over everything. At the front sat the judge, her expression neutral and unreadable. 2 tables faced her bench, one for each side. I took my place alone on the left. Rachel, Evan, and their attorneys sat across from me. When the hearing began, their lawyer stood first. He spoke calmly and confidently, outlining their position. He described me as an aging widow struggling to manage her affairs. He suggested that my memory had declined. He claimed that I had willingly signed documents granting financial authority to my daughter. According to him, my current objections were the result of confusion, not fraud. Each word felt like a small blade. I kept my eyes on the judge, forcing myself not to react. Inside, I was shaking. To hear my own child present me as weak and unreliable was more painful than any eviction notice. It felt like my entire life had been reduced to a stereotype of helplessness. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. I spoke about my independence. I described my daily routines. I explained how I managed my finances. I told the judge that I had never signed the documents in question. I referred to my records, my medical evaluations, and the inconsistencies I had found. My voice was steady, even though my heart was pounding. The judge listened carefully. She asked questions. She took notes. Her eyes moved back and forth between the 2 sides, searching for truth beneath the words. As the exchange continued, the tension in the room thickened. Rachel avoided my gaze. Evan stared at the table. Their lawyer pressed his arguments harder, repeating claims about concern and responsibility. Each statement felt rehearsed, polished, and hollow. While they spoke, memories flooded my mind. I remembered helping Rachel with homework at the same kitchen table. I remember staying up all night when she had the flu. I remembered cheering at her graduation. Those memories clashed painfully with the person she had become. Still, I did not waver. I knew that what I had presented so far was only the beginning. As the hearing moved forward, I realized that facts alone might not be enough. They had built a story around my supposed weakness. To destroy it, I would need something stronger. Something undeniable. I tightened my grip on my folder. My strongest evidence was still waiting, and soon I would have to use it. As the hearing continued, I felt the ground beneath me slowly shifting. The story Rachel and Evan had built was polished and confident, and for a moment, I worried that it might be enough to overshadow the truth. They had painted me as fragile, confused, and incapable of managing my own life. If that image took root, everything I loved could be taken from me. I knew I could not let that happen. I lowered my eyes to the folder resting on my lap and took a steady breath. Inside it were months of quiet preparation, pieces of evidence I had gathered without ever knowing I would one day need them. Now, they were my only shield. When the judge signaled for me to continue, I carefully opened the folder. First, I presented printed copies of private email exchanges between Rachel and Evan. These messages had been sent long before any legal action began. In them, they discussed my house as an asset, a resource to be leveraged. They talked about debts, pressure from creditors, and the urgency of finding money quickly. One message outlined a plan to gain control of my property and sell it within the year. I explained when I had discovered these emails and how I had preserved them. I described their dates, their metadata, and their connection to the legal filings. Each page was passed forward, examined, and entered into the record. Next, I placed my personal financial journal on the table. For decades, I had recorded every major expense, every deposit, every insurance payment. It was not fancy. It was simply a notebook filled with careful handwriting and calculations. Alongside it, I submitted bank statements and tax records. Together, they told a clear story. I had managed my finances responsibly for years. There was no pattern of recklessness, no evidence of confusion. Then I revealed the most disturbing detail. Among the emails was a conversation about relocating funds and selling the house through an international intermediary. They discussed using a real estate contact in Ontario, Canada, to move quickly and quietly. The purpose was simple. They wanted to convert my home into cash and disappear from the consequences. The courtroom fell silent. Rachel's face lost its color. Evan shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Their attorney flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything, to counter what was unfolding. The judge leaned forward. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, the communications, and the financial records. She compared dates, highlighted contradictions, and requested clarifications. Each inquiry pressed harder against the fragile structure of Rachel's case. While this was happening, my heart was breaking. Exposing my own daughter in public was not a victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something I had spent my life building. Every document I presented was another piece of our relationship falling apart forever. I mourned that loss, even as I fought for my survival. Still, I did not stop. I reminded myself that silence would not protect her, and it would certainly not protect me. As the evidence accumulated, I noticed the judge's posture change. She took more notes. Her questions grew sharper. Her tone became more focused. The balance of the room was shifting. For the first time that day, I felt hope. After reviewing the materials, the judge announced a brief recess to examine the new submissions. We were instructed to remain nearby. I gathered my papers and returned to my seat, my hands trembling once more. This time, it was not from fear alone, but from exhaustion and emotional strain. The truth was finally on the table. Now, all I could do was wait and pray that it would be enough. If you're still watching and shocked by what was just revealed, please comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. The consequences are about to unfold, and nothing will be the same. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The minutes that followed the judge's recess felt heavier than any hours I had ever lived through. I remained seated in the courtroom, my folder resting on my knees, my fingers interlocked so tightly that they began to ache. Around me, the room was silent except for the faint hum of air vents and the distant sounds of footsteps in the hallway. I stared at the empty judge's bench, replaying every word I had spoken in my mind. Had I been clear enough? Had I explained everything properly? Had I forgotten something important? Doubt crept in again, threatening to undo the fragile confidence I had built. Rachel sat across from me, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the floor. Evan whispered something to their attorney, his voice low and urgent. The lawyer nodded without looking convinced. The confident composure they had carried into the courtroom was gone. In its place was tension, uncertainty, and fear. When the door behind the bench finally opened, everyone rose automatically. The judge returned with a stack of papers in her hands. Her expression was firm, serious, and unreadable. As she took her seat, the air in the room seemed to tighten. She began by summarizing the evidence. She referenced the improper service. She cited the questionable authority documents. She addressed the email communications and financial records. She pointed out inconsistencies in timelines and unexplained transfers. Each sentence felt like another crack spreading through the structure Rachel and Evan had built. Then came the ruling. The enforcement of the property order was suspended effective immediately. The eviction process was halted. The related filings were placed under judicial review. The matter was being referred for formal investigation due to credible indications of fraud and financial misconduct. I exhaled slowly, realizing only then that I had been holding my breath. Across the room, Rachel's face drained of color. Evan's hands clenched into fists. Their attorney leaned toward them, speaking quickly, but neither seemed to hear him. The reality of what was happening was settling in. Their plan had failed, not quietly, not privately, but completely. Outside the courtroom, a small group of reporters had gathered. Word had traveled quickly in a town as close-knit as ours. Microphones appeared. Cameras flashed. Questions were whispered. I walked past them without stopping, my head down, my heart racing. By afternoon, local news websites were already publishing brief summaries. A retired teacher, a disputed property order, allegations of family fraud. It was strange seeing fragments of my life reduced to headlines. Later that day, I received confirmation that Rachel's professional license was under review, pending investigation. Evan had been contacted by federal authorities regarding irregular financial activity connected to the attempted property transfer. The consequences were spreading outward, touching every part of their carefully constructed lives. And still, no apology came. As we crossed paths in the hallway one final time, Rachel did not look at me. Evan avoided my direction entirely. There were no tears, no explanations, no expressions of regret, only distance. That hurt more than anger ever could. I returned home that evening emotionally drained. My house felt quieter than usual, as if it too had witnessed the collapse of something sacred. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same surface where we had once shared family dinners. Neighbors sent messages of support. Friends from church called to check on me. Their kindness was gentle and respectful, never intrusive. It reminded me that I was not alone, even when my own family had turned away. By nightfall, I understood one painful truth. The battle was over, but the family I once knew was gone forever, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed the court hearing, life moved forward in small, careful steps. There was no sudden return to normal, no dramatic sense of relief. Instead, there was silence, a deep, unfamiliar quiet that settled into my home and into my thoughts. For the first time in decades, I was learning how to live without the illusion that everything was safe simply because it was familiar. My first priority was security. I changed every lock on the house, including the back door, the garage entrance, and the small storage shed by the garden. I installed security cameras that covered the driveway, the porch, and the yard facing the lake. A video doorbell replaced the old brass knocker my husband had once polished every spring. Watching the live feed on my phone gave me a strange sense of comfort. It reminded me that I was in control again. Next, I turned my attention to my documents. One quiet afternoon, I spread every important paper across the dining table. Deeds, insurance policies, bank statements, tax records, court orders, and medical reports formed neat piles under the soft afternoon light. I purchased new folders and labeled each one carefully. I scanned everything into digital files and stored encrypted backups on an external drive. The fireproof safe, once neglected, became my most trusted ally. A week later, I met with an independent estate attorney. For years, I had postponed serious planning, believing there was plenty of time. Now, I understood how fragile that assumption was. Together, we established a legal trust to protect my property and finances. I appointed a neutral professional trustee who had no personal connection to my family. It felt strange placing my future in someone else's hands, but it also felt responsible. Rewriting my will was harder. Every sentence carried emotional weight. Deciding where my assets would go forced me to confront painful truths. I removed names I had once written with pride. I added charitable organizations and community programs that had supported me. When I signed the final document, my hand trembled, but my mind was clear. Healing required more than paperwork. At the suggestion of a friend, I joined a support group for the older adults who had experienced financial exploitation. Sitting in that circle, listening to stories that mirrored my own, was both heartbreaking and empowering. I realized how common betrayal was and how rarely victims spoke about it. Sharing my experience helped me release some of the shame I did not even know I was carrying. Around the same time, I began writing. At first, it was just scattered notes in a notebook, memories, emotions, questions without answers. Gradually, those fragments became chapters. Writing allowed me to organize not only events, but feelings. It helped me understand that survival was not weakness, it was resilience. Slowly, my mindset changed. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently. Instead, I focused on boundaries, on self-respect, on protecting my peace. I learned that forgiveness did not require forgetting, and compassion did not require vulnerability. My community remained my anchor. Friends from church invited me to lunches and volunteer projects. Neighbors checked in without being intrusive. Children I tutored returned with the handmade cards and shy smiles. Their presence reminded me that trust still existed in the world. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun melt into the lake, I realized something had shifted. I was no longer rebuilding out of fear. I was rebuilding out of strength. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I looked toward the future without dread. If you're still watching and feeling inspired by this journey, please comment number 8 below to show your support. We are now heading toward the final outcome and the most meaningful lesson of this story. Let's move on to the conclusion. 6 months passed quietly after the court suspended the property order and opened its investigation. Life no longer felt like an emergency. The constant tension that had once lived in my chest slowly faded into something softer, something closer to cautious peace. I returned to my routines, tended my garden, volunteered at church, and continued tutoring children in the afternoons. Still, part of me remained suspended in uncertainty, waiting for the final outcome. One cold morning in late autumn, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. It bore the seal of the county court. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, staring at it for several minutes before opening it. My hands were steady, but my heart was not. I knew that whatever was inside would close a chapter of my life that had changed me forever. I opened it slowly and read every line. The investigation was complete. Rachel had accepted a plea agreement. She received a suspended sentence, several years of probation, and was ordered to pay financial restitution. Her professional license remained restricted under disciplinary review. Evan had been convicted on federal charges related to financial misconduct and fraud. He was sentenced to prison and barred from managing financial accounts for the foreseeable future. Both were legally prohibited from contacting me. The court also confirmed that all fraudulent filings had been nullified. My ownership of the house was formally restored, reaffirmed, and protected. The title records were corrected. The liens were removed. Every shadow placed on my property had been erased. On paper, justice had been served. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt quiet. There was no celebration, no rush of happiness, no sense of triumph. The outcome did not erase betrayal. It did not return the daughter I once knew. It did not heal the fractures in my heart. It simply placed boundaries around the damage and prevented it from spreading further. In the days that followed, I received official copies of court orders and legal confirmations. I filed them carefully in my safe, alongside the documents I had guarded for years. Each stamped page represented protection, not pleasure. What surprised me most was the silence. Rachel never wrote. She never called. No apology arrived through attorneys or intermediaries. No explanation followed the verdict. Our relationship ended without closure, dissolved into distance and legal language. At first, that hurt deeply. Over time, I learned to accept it. I began to understand that accountability does not always come with remorse. Sometimes, justice simply draws a line and says, "Some no further." That line is not emotional. It is necessary. With the legal battles behind me, my life stabilized. Mornings returned to being peaceful. I walked by the lake, listened to birds, and enjoyed the changing seasons. I spent afternoons helping students with reading and mathematics. I planted winter bulbs and planned spring gardens. I laughed with neighbors and shared meals with friends. I was living again, not in reaction, but in intention. Occasionally, I thought back to that morning when a deputy stood at my door. The fear, the disbelief, the helplessness. It felt like a lifetime ago. I was not the same woman anymore. I was stronger, more aware, more grounded. And as I folded the court letter and placed it in its proper folder, I realized that my story was no longer about survival. It was about dignity. And it was finally mine to tell. Every morning now begins the same way. I sit on my front porch with a warm cup of coffee in my hands and watch the sun rise over Lake Michigan. The water reflects soft shades of gold and blue, and the air carries the quiet promise of a new day. In those moments, I feel something I once believed I had lost forever. Safety. Not the fragile kind that comes from routine, but the deep, earned kind that comes from understanding myself and my limits. Sometimes, as I watch the light move across the lake, my mind drifts back to the morning when a deputy sheriff stood at my door. I remember the fear in my chest, the disbelief, the way my hands shook as I held those papers. I remember thinking that my life was ending, that everything I had worked for was slipping away. It did not end. It changed. That experience taught me that family, no matter how close, does not automatically mean protection. Love does not give anyone the right to control, manipulate, or exploit. Blood relations do not cancel the need for boundaries. I learned that caring for others should never come at the cost of abandoning myself. I also learned the power of preparation. For years, I kept records out of habit. I organized documents because it felt responsible. I never imagined those simple actions would one day save my home and my independence. Now I understand that knowledge, documentation, and awareness are forms of self-respect. They are not signs of distrust. They are signs of wisdom. Age, I discovered, is not weakness. It is experience. It is perspective. It is the ability to remain steady when chaos demands surrender. Being older did not make me helpless. It made me resourceful. It gave me the patience to listen, the discipline to prepare, and the courage to stand firm when I was underestimated. Perhaps the hardest lesson was learning to release anger. For a long time, I carried bitterness toward Rachel. I replayed memories, searching for the moment when everything went wrong. I asked myself whether I had failed as a mother. Eventually, I realized that those questions had no healing answers. Her choices were her own. My responsibility was to protect my peace. Forgiveness, for me, did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to live in resentment. Community saved me more than I ever expected. Friends who checked in quietly, neighbors who watched over my home, church members who prayed without asking questions, students who returned with smiles and gratitude. Their presence reminded me that betrayal does not erase goodness from the world. If there is one message I hope others take from my story, it is this: listen to your instincts. Pay attention to discomfort. Protect what you have built. Do not let guilt silence your voice. Defending yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. As I finish my coffee and watch birds glide across the lake, I feel no need for revenge or recognition. My victory is simple. I am still here. My home is still mine. My dignity remains intact. And in the quiet of each new morning, I find peace. Some stories do not end with applause or celebration. They end with quiet understanding. They remind us that strength is often built in silence, through patience, preparation, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Life does not always protect us from betrayal, but it gives us the ability to rise when trust is broken. True resilience is not about anger or revenge. It is about clarity, dignity, and the choice to protect what matters most. This journey shows that age does not weaken wisdom, and kindness does not require self-sacrifice. When we learn to respect ourselves, set boundaries, and trust our instincts, we reclaim control over our lives. Peace is not something we are given. It is something we earn. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and stay connected for more meaningful stories. Your voice matters.